Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books in Critical Theory, which is a podcast that's part of the New Books Network. On this episode, I'm talking to Professor Ellen Helsper about her new book, Digital Disconnect, The Social Causes and Consequences of Digital Inequalities. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor to be on the podcast. Big fan. So it's great to be presenting my book.
It's great to have you. And it's funny talking about the perfect kind of timing of a book. Obviously, academic books take quite a while to write, but you couldn't have picked a better time to talk about digital inequalities at a point where, certainly over the last kind of year or so, particular sections of the world have, really become heavily or even more dependent on digital and digital infrastructure for the, I suppose, kind of conduct of their daily lives. And inequalities and an inequality perspective is really, really crucial to this. And I suppose before we get into the sort of individual themes that the book covers, it might be good to introduce the book just by saying a little bit about what kind of got you interested in writing about digital inequalities, and I guess maybe the kind of the approach or the kind of framework that you use to think through these issues.
Yeah, well, I think in two ways. It's timely, but it's also the result of a process of decades in terms of the interest that I've had in the research that I'm doing in my field. So I've been kind of interested in identity and representation and feeling comfortable in a mediated world since very, very long. I started by researching things like soaps and telenovelas in Latin America, and how people felt represented and how their stories were represented in that space and how they felt comfortable in a mediated world. And then this mediated world became digital. In that sense, it's been these kinds of ideas around representation and belonging in a world that is mediated, and in this case, becoming increasingly digitized, have always been very important in my work. And obviously, since now in this kind of digitization of society, our everyday lives in all its aspects are becoming represented or lived in digital spaces. This has become increasingly kind of the focus of my research, to really look at the digital aspect of it. So the underlying idea of the book is or the underlying framework of the book is based on the corresponding fields approach or framework. It's something I presented in 2012. And basically that kind of approach is, the basic premise of it is to understand the links between social or historical inequalities and digital inequalities, because in parallel to societies becoming more digital, we have also seen an increased interest in what has been observed in many places in the world, the kind of increase in or amplification of inequalities that have historically existed. So this, in parallel to the digitization of society, we've seen also an increased concern about kind of increasing inequalities. And the premise of the corresponding fields model is that when people get access to information and communications technologies, they are actually most likely to use it to increase the resources that they already have, and are less likely to be able to do so in areas or domains where they are less well off. And that's a slightly different model from, or kind of approach from, how digital inequalities have been studied so far, in the sense that it's been a very descriptive approach in kind of noting which people are online or not online, or engaged in certain ways or not engaged in certain ways. But there's been less theorization about kind of the specific ways in which specific groups or which specific regions of the world might be more likely to be excluded from the digital space or not. And in the corresponding fields model, I identify kind of 4 broad domains of these resources where we've seen historical inequalities express themselves. So we can think about economic inequalities, and including inequalities in terms of wealth and employment and education, or the other domain that I look at is kind of social inequalities, which includes our everyday relationships, or kind of how our networks and how the communities that we're part of, informal relationships, but also formal relationships and ties to other people. And then the third domain that I also look at is kind of more what we might call cultural, which is kind of inequalities in terms of what kind of normative frameworks exist, and around how we should think or behave that puts people in a certain kind of status position within society. It's often associated with different identity characteristics such as gender or ethnicity or religion, where we create kind of hierarchies based on what is valued, which ideas are valued and which are not. And then the last area or domain that I kind of identify in that model is that of the more personal resources, the kind of those things that are unique to us as individuals, physical or mental health and personality, intelligence. Obviously, I recognize that, economic and social and cultural disadvantage and inequalities are often overlap. They are compound. A lot of people, often we see that those who are disadvantaged in one of these domains also have disadvantages in other domains. But important in the corresponding fields model is that it really predicts, for example, if somebody has lots of social resources, they have a really strong community that they're part of, really stable kind of relationships, positive relationships in their everyday lives. When they get access to technologies or when societies become increasingly digital, they're really able to take up these opportunities around kind of socializing and connecting to others. Well, if these same people who might not have economic resources, they might not be that wealthy. So the same access and the kind of skills that they acquire to use technologies are less likely to be translated into kind of economic outcomes in terms of saving money or getting job opportunities or things like that. So that's kind of the underlying basis. It's really a theorization of the specific ways in which digital inequalities are linked to social or historical inequalities. And one of the things that I discuss in the book is how actually these explanations for inequalities, for digital inequalities, or that process from social to digital back to social inequalities becomes increasingly complex as we start kind of moving towards areas that are currently less studied in the field of digital inequalities, such as these kind of cultural inequalities or social inequalities in terms of the relationships that we build and the qualities of them, that they become increasingly complex in terms of their explanations and also have been understudied, while the economic aspects of both social or historical and digital inequalities have been studied much more extensively.
One way the book, I guess, populates the model that you've sketched out there is with these, I guess they're kind of like individual case studies of sort of, whether we call them, users or citizens, individuals. There's a real kind of sense of case study people that come through the book. And I was quite struck, actually, as you were talking me through the model there, of the kind of classic risk for academic models of sort of removing a sense of, well, what is it like to experience this? And I wonder, actually, if you could say a bit about why you adopted those individual case studies, and maybe we'll talk about a couple of them as well.
Yeah. So for each of these, the book is kind of organized around these 5 domains of kind of resources or potential areas of inequalities. And while the book presents a lot of statistical, quantitative research, findings or data that have come out of the research that we're doing, it is, as you say, really hard often for people to relate those statistics to the lived experience of what it is like to be disadvantaged or excluded or vulnerable in a certain way in this digital society. What does it mean for our everyday lives? And so that was why I, based on the qualitative work that we've been doing, included these 5 vignettes that kind of exemplify kind of the specific difficulties that people who lack some of these resources or who might come from groups that have been historically disadvantaged in terms of these resources, kind of what their experiences is. So I talk about Ben, who is kind of an unemployed 42-year-old man, divorced, lives in the UK, and who has, has a kind of definitely in a kind of a traditional sense, or in objectively speaking, economically disadvantaged, and how his lack of connectivity or his lack of quality connectivity kind of leads to real problems in terms of how he's able to participate in an economic sense in society, be a full citizen in that sense. And then in the chapter that discusses the kind of more educational or learning opportunities that are available within digital societies, I talk about Anna, who lives in Los Angeles, and a 21-year-old. She dropped out of school. She had a kid quite young, and works in a supermarket, but does want to kind of improve her opportunities by getting education through technologies. But there's all kinds of barriers that she faces in trying to do this because of her lack of formal education or exposure to these kind of learning moments. And then we have Priya, who is kind of the kind of vignette or case study for the chapter on civic engagement. Who lives in Kolkata as a 55-year-old married woman from a relatively higher caste, but she has a disability and is obviously in this case a woman who, in a society where there's still very big gender inequalities, especially in terms of how to participate politically. And then we have Carol, who comes from Sao Paulo. And she's a 17-year-old. It's kind of one of these people who you would say this is a digital native living in a big city. She's doing well at school, but she has been bullied offline and is kind of socially isolated, and that has all kinds of consequences in terms of how she experiences the social aspects and is able to take advantage of the social aspects of information and communication technologies such as the internet. And then in the last case study or vignette that I use is that I discuss is Yun Wen from in China, who is a gay man living not in one of the big East Coast cities, but 28-year-old. He's taken care of his parents, but now is kind of stuck in the village or in the town. It's still a big city where he is living, where there's not a lot of people like him. He has an ethnic minority, a vivid gamer online and DJ, but like the kind of way in which he can express himself in the digital space based on these kind of offline characteristics, and his offline life is very limited, and he feels like he's pushed into presenting himself and his interests and his voice in a certain way in that space because of the expectations that people have of how somebody like him should behave. And all these case studies and these vignettes are kind of compilations of qualitative research. They don't actually correspond to specific individuals, but they are kind of express a collective experience of people that I've come across and been very lucky to have the opportunity to interact with and to hear how they experience this increased digitization of society. And they kind of highlight some of the barriers and the problems that people like them have around the world, and how also in that sense the context of the country or the city in which they live kind of also influences their experiences, shapes their experiences, not just in this kind of physical analog world, but also in the sense of the kind of the digital world that runs in parallel and overlaps, as is embedded in that in these modern societies.
You mentioned that these kind of ideal type case studies, along with the sort of more, say, structural analysis, gives sort of two broad elements to the book. One is the kind of the set of present problems, and then is some future inequalities that you'd mentioned, sort of seeing less attention. And I wonder, actually, as a good way of getting a flavour of both, those two categories, which we'll take in turn, but also given a sense of some of the inequalities that you're trying to write about. If you could introduce maybe the kind of the present issues, particularly the intersection of what I guess I'd call kind of access inequalities, so things that are to do with cost of computing or cost of devices. You'd mentioned the kind of the civic engagement issue, but I was very interested in those economic inequalities and the way that, in some ways, the discussion obscures questions about skills inequalities too.
Yeah. So this is kind of, in a way, the way the field of the study of digital inequalities has developed over the decades. The last 2 decades really is when this field has really taken off, and the book in that sense also follows this kind of historical development, not just in terms of the domains of resources that we talked about before, but also in terms of the development of the discussions and the kind of ideas of the most imminent or the most prominent problems and issues that we should be looking at. And in the beginning of this kind of the development of this field, we really talked about kind of this first level divides, which is really the emphasis on that word divide, on who is online, who has access, who doesn't have access. And that is still kind of a prominent a position in policymaking and in research, especially in the global south, it has to be said, where the emphasis is really on making sure that people have access to technologies. And obviously, this is important. Without access, we're not going to be able to use technologies, or without kind of exposure to digital technologies, we're not going to be able to reap the benefits that they bring. And but there is a step beyond that. First of all, the kind of the way in which we've talked about access in relation to these kind of economic inequalities is problematic, because it's been often interpreted in a very simplistic sense in terms of just kind of any kind of access. But it's now become very clear that one type of access is not the same as another type of access, and we see that, for example, in many countries, having access only to a smartphone, or with the smartphone as the main way of accessing the technology, that this does not allow you to take advantage of these opportunities that are available online in the same ways. Like, we can just imagine, for example, trying to fill out a form, or uploading or creating a CV, or in an education setting, doing your homework and writing an essay. The device is not necessarily made for that. One of the things that we also see with these kind of single kind of platforms, which is very much based around apps, is that they don't allow us to learn by doing, because they're very limited in terms of the flexible or the kind of actions that we can take. Which, if you use, let's say, a laptop or a kind of a PC, there's much more room to play around, to create things. These are designed for us to participate, not just in a passive way in terms of using technologies that are with certain functions in the way that they were built, but also to kind of be creative and to contribute our own content. So there's a really problematic idea of how access has been operationalized in research, but also in policy, where it's about giving out devices without thinking about the opportunities for active participation that these devices bring. And then in many societies where we saw diffusion of kind of access to the internet and related technologies increase and be exponentially, and actually inequalities diminishing in that sense, we saw that still there were quite large inequalities in terms of whether technologies were used at all, and in the ways in which they were used. So in the book, I also make a distinction between potential access, which is the kind of availability of these technologies in our environment, and actual access, which is the use of these technologies when they are available, which is not the same. It's another thing that we need to think about. But in terms of the skills, we really see that in the end, what makes it possible for us to take up the opportunities and avoid some of the risks that are there, or the kind of negative aspects of technology use, is this, whether we have skills or not. And we can talk a little bit maybe later about what types of skills we should think about. But also, even when we have access and we have skills, whether certain types of content are online, are available to us, that are relevant to us, services, content, things that reflect our interests and our needs, is another way in which we might be excluded from that digital space. So even if we have access and we have skills, if what we need is not there or not presented in a way that is useful to us, then we will still not be able to engage in that digital world in that way. And so in the development of the field, what we've seen is that first level of digital inequalities, which is around access, which has been theorized. And people said, actually, that's not enough. It's not enough to just deal with access. We then look at the kind of the second level of digital inequalities, which is around the absence of skills or the lack of skills to be able to use these technologies in beneficial ways. And then simultaneously, the lack of content that's relevant or presented in a way that's useful to us. And then actually, and this is where we are now, and what this book is really kind of framed around is the third level of inequalities, which is kind of systematic inequalities, not just in access or in skills or in terms of the content that's available, but in terms of the outcomes that people get from the use of technologies, or that, the kind of people's increases or decreases in well-being, socioeconomic and sociocultural well-being in increasingly digital societies. And that is actually, for me, the most important point about this, because in a way, I'm not that interested in the digital aspect of this. And so throughout the book, I try to talk about social and digital inequalities as linked, because in the end, what is important for me is how the digitization of society might lead to the amelioration or the exacerbation of historical inequalities as societies become more digital in terms of, social-cultural, socioeconomic, and social-psychological well-being. It's the everyday, kind of our everyday lives, and how we live those that is important, and the extent to which the digitization can either make that worse or improve that situation. So that's the kind of third level of digital inequalities that I talk about in the book, and which is kind of refers to the consequences of digital inequalities. So that's the kind of sphere that kind of the debate that has been developing in the field, and that the book is also built around, and the ideas are presented along those lines.
I think that is really crystallized perfectly quite near the end of the book, actually, in some of the final discussions, where you sort of bring up a question, and you've mentioned the kind of questions of representation and the issues of kind of who has access to making digital content, as well as who or what is represented. But this boils down to a question which is a social question about, well, who is given value in our digital world, which, whether it's individuals or communities. And I'm really interested to hear a bit more about that question, actually, and where the book sort of indicates that we might end up kind of replicating some of our existing global inequalities about which individuals and which communities, which social groups, which nations are given value, and how others are, continue to be marginalized, excluded, and precisely rendered valueless. And I'm really interested to hear a bit more about that, because I think at the end of the book that really brings together both the relationship between the social and the digital, but also, as you say, where the field kind of is now in terms of its most contemporary debates.
Yeah. So I think that is a very a great question, and a very complex question that I struggled with throughout the book to answer that in ways that are both give nuance but also give some clarity to where we do see a potential for improvement. And I think I call myself a kind of relative optimist in that sense, but kind of with reason in terms of what the future might bring. And I think that's where it's important to distinguish these kind of more, let's say, economic and kind of meritocratic ideals of kind of what how society is shaped, and what could be important in terms of well-being. So what we see is that, for example, when we talk about inequalities in access, we see that the most important predictors of these remain things like poverty and deprivation in an economic sense. So it's the people who have, who are unemployed and have lower levels of education, and have had less economic opportunities, that are less likely to have high quality access. And similarly, they are also less likely to have these kinds of kind of basic technical operational skills to be able to use the technologies in ways that might benefit them in terms of learning or future economic opportunities. And in that sense, when we talk about a potential future and kind of the way it's going, with the kinds of policy that are now being put in place, for example, and the kinds of research that is done and what it tells us to inform policies and interventions, is that there we can see that kind of individual economic interventions, also technological interventions, can be quite useful and beneficial. If the main cause of an inequality in access is poverty, then if we improve infrastructure and we provide access, or we lower the costs of getting devices and quality devices, then that would be a part of the solution. Yeah, and it's towards a more equal future in some sense of participation. The same thing is that if the main problem with, for example, these kinds of more technical skills, these functional skills to be able to use technologies to kind of get your benefits or to get economic outcomes or to participate in courses and learning online, if the main cause of that is the lack of training, formal training, then we can set up courses, we can teach, and we can engage individuals who lack these kinds of skills in formal and formal learning opportunities, and these can be individual interventions. And in that sense, so there is some optimism. And if policies are designed in the right ways, and we see that in our research, if you reach the right kinds of people who lack these kinds of opportunities in terms of access and skills training, they do help improve the situation. However, as we go along in the book and we come to these more social, cultural, and participatory types of inequalities, such as this kind of civic engagement, which is really about whose voices are being heard, who has the power to influence the way our society is shaped, the kind of, as we talked about, the values that are top of the agenda, the kind of debates that are top of the agenda, the issues that people deem worthy to be discussing. And in terms of social interactions, the networks, the kind of feelings of belonging to a society in your everyday life, in your everyday community, but also in terms of what you see represented in terms of what types of content are liked and promoted and prominent in these online spaces, then we see that solutions become increasingly more complex because they become increasingly less technical and simple. It becomes more collective in a way. It becomes less about teaching an individual skills which they lack, or with not so much about giving an individual access to a device, but it comes much more about understanding these kinds of everyday processes around whose voices get heard and who is respected. Because what we see is that once people have access and skills, when they then enter into these kind of social communicative spaces or communal spaces online, these public spaces that independent of their level of skill and their level of access, they are still much more likely to have negative experiences such as being bullied or being harassed or discriminated against when they come from groups that have been historically kind of vulnerable or excluded or discriminated against. And so the solutions there have to be social to a much greater extent than the ones in these areas that we were talking about before in terms of education and employment. So because these processes are more subtle, it's not so much. It's sometimes it's explicit about kind of the things that we hear about now about trolling and about those kinds of things. But really often it is through our passive use, through us liking the things that are comfortable to us or that are normatively valued in the societies that we live in. And I give some examples in the book. For example, in the chapter on inequalities and content creation and production and consumption, it's all of us together who create popular content, and often what is popular content is content that corresponds to what we expect people of certain backgrounds to produce. And then there's two things there where we can see the inequalities. One is in that the people who are most popular or the most prolific content creators still tend to come from very specific regions in the world and from what have historically been more privileged groups. And the people who come from privileged groups often have a wider range of content that they contribute to, not just content that is very relevant to what we might think of as their social cultural groups, but also they have a voice in framing other groups that they might not, let's call it, belong to or identify with explicitly, while the people who are not from those groups have to often have a much more limited type of content that they are able to produce. So like I give the example of vloggers, for example, where in the UK, if you look at the top 50 vloggers, about 43 of them are men, first of all. And then the 7 women top vloggers in 2018, most of them were beauty vloggers. So most of them were to do with kind of beauty products or kind of beauty kind of topics. While the men, the 47 men, not only were there more men there, but they also were able to talk about a broader range of topics, right? From sports to lifestyle to fitness to politics to all these things. And so in these public platforms, what we see is that not only in terms of quantity are kind of certain privileged groups overrepresented, but also in terms of the kind of nature of that content, it's in a way stereotypical. And so that's one aspect of it in terms of who gets valued, just in a quantitative sense. And obviously then that's what we get represented with, right? And through algorithms, we get represented with that. We click on it and it kind of reinforces this kind of public dominance of these certain life experiences and views. But then the other side of it is that when people from less privileged or less dominant groups in these societies do go in these online spaces and participate, the reactions to it are often much more negative. And in the book, I describe in this kind of process in 2 ways. One is for Yun Wen, the Chinese young man who is a gay male who is also a DJ and wants to present himself in a certain ways, but then he realizes that when he goes online and tries to present himself in a certain way, which might not be stereotypically gay, let's say, whatever that means for the people who are in these online spaces, he doesn't get heard, he doesn't get valued, and so that silences him in a certain way. Like he just he stops presenting himself like that. Or if we think about Priya in terms of civic participation, while she is able to be online and she has skills and she is part of these spaces, for example, there is, her family has been involved in charities with education for young girls. But when she makes political comments, she gets told off, and that's something that she shouldn't be doing. That's not part of her status, especially not in terms of the kind of cost, this kind of class that she belongs to. And so in some ways she gets silenced as well because of that negativity. And what we see is that people who come from these groups or who have these negative experiences might then go into what I call digital hiding, or they go into safe spaces, which is logical. They go into spaces where there's other people like them, where they can share these experiences without fear of being kind of discriminated or harassed because of the expressions of their identities. But what that means is that the public spaces that all of us access, the kind of content that we all see, becomes dominated by the kind of norm, the normative kind of ideal of a kind of a more dominant or privileged class, while these and that people who don't come from these groups still get exposed to that content, but that let's say the privileged don't get exposed anymore to other kinds of experiences or worldviews, because these people have moved into these safe spaces and that content doesn't become as much part of the public domain. So in a way, we are all responsible for perpetuating and amplifying that. And through, obviously, the way that technologies work is through algorithms, through what we like and through what we click on and what we spend time with online. This is a kind of an amplifying effect. Yeah. And it's not to say that people who are discriminated and harassed should be forced to go in public spaces and continue to be harassed, right? It's not about saying that it's the people who have been kind of put in this position of vulnerability that need to sort it out. It's actually the opposite argument that I make, is that this is a collective responsibility, and that is actually often these processes of exclusion are not conscious in a way. Of course, we have, examples, especially in recent times, of explicit discrimination and trolling, but it's often kind of implicit. We don't even realize that we are more likely to like content that corresponds to what we think is appropriate of a certain person who comes from a certain background. So I think that's the kind of things that happen, processes, and these are less explicit, and the solutions to these are less technical, right? These are solutions which are about awareness creation. This is where organizations like civil society groups or human rights groups need to come together and realize that this is something that needs to be done, based also on the long experience that they have of collective action and changing normative frameworks in wider society. Because in the end, we're not going to solve racism and sexism and homophobia or ableism online if they still exist kind of in broader structural sense in wider society. And if people are expressing those things in everyday life, there is this vicious cycle that we're in, and it cannot be broken just by a technological intervention. This really has to be kind of a more collective joint responsibility of people deciding kind of what kind of society they want to live in, and how our own actions and or consumption of content online might lead to the exclusion of certain voices or certain types of people and content in that digital space. So that's quite a complex, and policymakers or even kind of researchers don't often like it when you come with that kind of conclusion, because that means that this is a multi-stakeholder, multi-layered, complex problem where you need to think in the long term and not in easy short-term solutions, which is a very different story from saying, okay, let's give cheap access and improve infrastructure, or let's set up some formal training courses so that people acquire these digital skills so that they can have jobs in this future that is becoming digital, and where we need to slot in workers that will be able to do these tasks within that digital economy. The things that I just talked about are much more complex and are really about what is it that we value within kind of our societies, and that are reflected in that digital space, and that will need both technological and but majoritarily social policy and solutions.
I mean, you've given a wonderful kind of spoken word illustration of some of the diagrams actually that are in the book, and the kind of the sense of the importance of interconnections, both actually in terms of the corresponding fields approach, but also in terms of the various different levels of divides that are going on in terms of digital inequalities. I mean, one of the other things that, hopefully our conversation has made clear is just the richness of the book and the amount of both, kind of detail that's in there for the reader, but the amount of topics and the kind of breadth of issues that are covered. And in that sense, it leads me to a kind of concluding question, which seems sort of slightly unfair, given you've produced this really kind of comprehensive and absolutely important text, and then to say, so what are you doing next? what are you working on now in terms of, I guess, maybe more things about digital inequalities, although you mentioned actually maybe kind of inequalities more generally is really the interesting thing, rather than the digital per se or on its own. So yeah, what sort of projects are coming next?
Yeah, so all the work that is presented in the book is kind of heavily based on the research projects that I continue to be involved in, which are kind of at the moment two large international projects. One is the From Digital Skills to Tangible Outcomes project, which looks at these processes and really on how they're situated locally. One of the things that I do in the book and that I want to continue to build on is to kind of finish with the conclusion that we need to think about social digital ecologies. So the spaces that we live in, we live our everyday lives in. This can be our neighborhoods, but also our online spaces and networks, and really understand how these kinds of dynamics of our everyday environments kind of shape the extent to which disadvantage or vulnerability is expressed. And that's an important part of also these From Digital Skills to Tangible Outcomes projects, is that's where we're taking it to look at these everyday ecologies, the social and digital environments that we live in, and how they shape our engagement in positive and negative ways with technologies. So that's one important aspect of what I'm doing right now. And then the other aspect of it, which is really related to the kind of latter half of the book, which is about really looking at more social and cultural well-being in increasingly digital spaces or societies, and then really thinking about a future world in which these technologies are much more going to be much more invisible and embedded. We can think, there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence, obviously, but I'm thinking more in terms of embedded AR, augmented reality, embedded tech, things like VR, which are becoming part of these kinds of worlds where we live in, where the digital and the kind of analog become much harder to separate. And I'm really there going back to where I started in terms of, feeling like that you belong and can participate in equal ways in these kinds of social and digital spaces, and to what extent our behaviors and our actions influence how comfortable others feel and how they feel heard and valued and appreciated. So really moving and expanding those kinds of last 2 or 3 chapters in the books before the conclusions, which are moving more towards thinking about spaces rather than use of technologies, thinking about engaging in digital spaces where technologies might not be that visible anymore, and where therefore these processes are going to be much more difficult to study as separate. They're going to be about inequalities in digital societies and less about the links between social and digital inequalities, but more about design and action and inaction within these digital spaces.